The development of the concept of the Trinity between the 2nd and 5th centuries CE was a process of a conclusion in search of an argument. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and throughout the New Testament, the various authors represent Jesus overwhelmingly as not God, but also in some way God. But they make sense of it in different ways. For instance, the author of the Gospel of Mark seems to represent kind of an adoptionist Christology, whereas the author of the Gospel of John has a more philosophically oriented kind of emanationist Christology. And then Paul seems to have kind of an angelomorphic Christology. And this makes sense to all of them, as I have argued and will continue to argue, because it resonated so well with the universal intuitive logic of divine images. This is what made it so that people were comfortable with the idea of Jesus being both not God and also God, because that's exactly how they rationalized divine images. But when it came to explaining this or representing it narratively, they had different ways of making it make sense. But once you get outside the New Testament and are looking back on the New Testament as a single corpus, and once you believe that it must represent a single articulation of Jesus's nature and being in relationship to God, you need to come up with an argument. You have the conclusion, Jesus is both not God and also God. Now you need an argument. How can that be? And that was the challenge that was addressed by Christian philosophers and apologists between the middle of the 2nd century CE and the 5th century CE. And part of the reason was so that the gospel could be made defensible and intellectually satisfying to the Greco-Roman intelligentsia, so that Christianity could further spread within the ancient Mediterranean. And in that process of a conclusion in search of an argument, they very quickly settled on the ideas of ousia and hypostasis, or person and being. Initially, these words could be used interchangeably, but you could also have multiple persons and one being, but in the sense of multiple different human beings who all shared the same humanity or the same nature as a human. But later on, that began to shift, and you could talk about ousia as a single instantiation of being, and then they decided, well, we can also multiply the hypostases within that single instantiation of being. And this was the key to what was formalized in 325 CE at the Council of Nicaea, the notion that you have multiple persons all sharing the exact same instantiation of being. And one of the biggest changes was that the consensus view in the earliest period of that development was subordinationism, that Jesus was not equal to the Father. But that had to change because of the philosophical implications of subordinationism if Jesus is going to be identified as God, because in the conventional wisdom of the divine, to be divine was to have all the superlatives, and so you could not have a deity who was also subordinate. And so what was formalized at Nicaea was the idea that you had three different persons who were co-eternal, co-equal, and consubstantial. They all shared the exact same instantiation of that being, and none was subordinate to the other. And this didn't make a whole lot of sense, but it didn't matter because it was a philosophically defensible framework for understanding how Jesus could both not be God and also be God. This was not following the data where they lead. This was beginning from the conclusion, Jesus is both not God and also God, and then skirting around the data to find an argument that can make it work. And the reason that it worked for everybody is because now Christianity had the weight of empire that they could put behind this conclusion. They could say, sign on the dotted line, or you're going to be exiled. And there was still a fierce debate that went on for over a century before it finally settled down. But there are still Christian groups that disagree about fundamental issues related to the Trinity. But that process of developing the concept of the Trinity that started in the middle of the 2nd century CE and lasted until the 5th century CE was a process of a conclusion in search of a philosophically defensible argument. I discuss this in much more detail in chapter 17 of my forthcoming book, The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong about Scripture's most controversial issues, which comes out April 29th. You can pre-order now. And if you would like other books that are already available that talk a bit more about this, here are some things that you can check out. And the fit for this video has been the X-Men cartoon. Do-do-do-do-do-do-do.